Hi everybody, Fintan here from Dams and Cloud. This week I'm doing an interview with my good colleague Stephen Hind from a company called Steegle. Steegle is a really interesting business. They have been in the Google Workspace space for as long as Dams and Cloud, or over the last 10 years. But they focus primarily on Google Sites, and that is going to be the topic that myself and Stephen are going to talk about today. So I just might start with a quick introduction of Stephen. Stephen is the co-founder of Steegle, and he's the technical director of the organization. They focus on making or creating awesome intranet solutions, and have done so for many of our customers. And I love some of the extra features that they add. They've created some interesting scripts and tools that add additional features to Google Sites that make it a even more impressive tool or solution for customers. Stephen, as I said, has been in the ecosystem for quite a long time, 10 or 15 years. He's been working on Google Workspace related tools. He has 25 years experience within the IT industry. No, I don't have quite as much. He's got a few years on me. And we're going to have an interesting conversation today about Google Sites. So thanks very much for joining us today, Steve.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to know, what was the thing that kind of got you guys into, or you particularly into the Google Sites area rather than Drive or some other area? Why particularly did you focus in on that? Maybe you could tell us a little bit of your background on that.
Sure. So I started personally using Google Workspace a long time ago, while it was still called Gmail for your domain beta. And so it was in the early stages where I'd set it up for the company I was working for, and that's what we're using as our email system. Then developed to Google Apps. So you had the ability to have Gmail and Google Calendar. And one day when I was signing in, it said, "Have you tried our new service, Google Sites?" My background prior to that is I've been a website developer for a number of years, doing that in the NHS as well in the UK. And from then I thought, oh, that's a good idea. Let me go and have a look at that. I like that. And so I got into it. It was like, that's a bit weird. It's a tool to make a website rather than HTML coding, which is what I've been doing in CSS and JavaScript. And I've been developing PHP apps and connected to databases and all that kind of stuff. But Google Sites was a new content management system. So I had a go and I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And I thought, I need to get some questions answered. Went along to the Google Sites help forum and got the questions answered. And I kind of, I get it. I see what Google's trying to do with this product. And so then I stuck around in the Google Sites help forum, and I ended up answering far more questions than I asked, which then got me introduced to all kinds of people at Google, part of the top contributor program. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. I'm there to answer questions. And so from that, the idea came was, well, if Google Sites is so good, if I think Google Sites is great, why don't I show people how to use Google Sites using a Google site? And so that's where the Steegle came from. It was the name came up just out of a conversation with someone that's what I should go for, and it played on my mind. And I thought, well, I could just buy a domain name. That shouldn't do any harm. So I bought the domain name and then moved on from there. So yeah, developed a site to give how-tos on how to use Google Sites, and that then developed into my full-time job.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about, if someone was to come to Steegle right now and come to your website and your business, what is it that they would find, and what's the sort of 60-second pitch for Steegle?
Yeah, so a lot of people who come to us are Google Workspace users wanting an intranet, and Google Site is the natural place to do that, because you don't need to worry about signing, you don't need to worry about security. Google's got all that covered for you. It's a very simple and easy to use tool, but where we come in is it can be difficult to get it just exactly how you want. And so we've got the experience to say, this is how to get it done right. And we've got that extra tools that we can add in to plug the gaps that Google Sites doesn't have. So that's what Steegle can offer.
I think it would be interesting for people just to hear a little bit more about the additional apps that you guys make, because you make some really interesting sort of apps and scripts and stuff that help, as I said earlier on, elevate Google Sites to kind of the next level of that sort of digital workspace solution, your people tool and your Drive tool. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those for a minute.
So one of the things missing from classic sites and new sites in general is the news tool. So any classic site user who's moving from classic to new will be missing the announcements page feature. So we've developed a tool that just sits in the browser, built-in app script. You can drop it straight into the site again, because it's in app script in your workspace environment. The security is all covered, signing in is all covered, and that gives you a way of having a little gadget to summarize what's happening with news, or something that's happening on the site or off site. So that's one tool. The big tool that we offer is Steegle People, and that's an employee directory, makes automatic org charts, and you can add all kinds of information to that. Again, all 100% stored in Google Workspace, so you don't need to worry about your information being disappearing off into a different cloud storage. It's all there in your Google Workspace, just there. Then also, because New Sites stores everything in Google Drive as the files, so if you want to add a file to New Sites, you've got to put it in Drive, and then you can link to it, or you can embed a Drive folder. The embedding of Drive folders that Google Sites gives has some key things missing. So for instance, it doesn't have a folder hierarchy view, so you can't navigate around. It doesn't have the ability to search for files either. So the site search won't find content in Drive. So in our gadget that we call Steegle Share, we've got a little search box there to search for the files, the content of the files. So you can do that on site without having to leave. And you can use that to give you that single source of truth and have that dedicated area to store files in, rather than just doing a search in Drive and finding 3 versions of the same document. So yeah, that's what we use it for.
So, Steve, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the new Google Sites, as we're jokingly calling it, because obviously it's been around for a while. Maybe you could tell us when it first launched and how it sort of changed from that basic Google Sites system that you sort of fell in love with all them years ago.
Sure, yeah. So the new Google Sites, that was the name given to it by Google to differentiate it from classic Google Sites, what was existing at the time. That came about in 2016, so not exactly new, being 5 years old at this point. And so when it started, again, Google took the approach of making a completely new product rather than it being an upgrade on the existing product. And so it's a completely new product, and they built it from the ground up. So started off even more basic than it is today. So for instance, the first version, within the first month, you couldn't publish a site publicly. You could only use it internally. It had to be accessed through a Google account. And so that's how it started off. But from then on, it's grown and has got a lot more features, and very much more capable, but still has fundamentally the idea of keeping it simple to make it an easy tool to use for anybody. So that's Google's goal with it. It used to have, when it first launched, a strapline on the bottom, made with the new Google Sites, an effortless way to create sites. So it's still quite easy to make a site, but also easy to get it wrong. And it's obviously everything takes effort, but yeah, it's that's Google's approach. They're keeping it simple, so lots of people can find it useful, but it won't necessarily do everything for everybody.
And what do you feel are the kind of core advantages of the new Google Sites over the old one?
So a completely new system built on new technology. The classic sites, and this is probably why it needed to get replaced, wasn't mobile responsive, and it doesn't work as well on the multi-screen environment that we live in now. And also the technology it's running on was like more than a decade old. So it had to move on. It was relying on your web browser being able to generate HTML from you entering, the content. And so of course different web browsers have different HTML, presumably they'll generate different code, and then so Google Sites had to standardize that in such a way so that it works for everyone in the same way and makes a standardized site.
And then I think it'd be interesting for you to just go through what are the kind of core differences between the new Google Sites that people should be aware of. So if they're kind of coming to it, perhaps from the old one, but even fresh, what are the kind of core differences that they kind of need to know about?
Yeah, sure. So the core advantages is it's super simple to use. Anyone can make a Google site, and they can make it quickly. So it's nice and easy to use. The site that they then created will work on any screen size. It will do a good job of rendering the site and be useful on any screen size. And it will automatically do things. So for instance, if you try and look at a Google Sheet on mobile, it shows you a thumbnail of that instead of the entire sheet, because you're never going to be able to see it properly in a very small embedded window on a website. So it makes it a thumbnail. You can click on the thumbnail and it opens out to be much bigger. And it can do that with various different things. It linearizes the content nicely for you. So again, you've got that nice and easily on mobile devices, and so it works well. But because it's new and because it's been maintained by Google and using new technology, in the future, you're going to be able to do a lot more with it. When Google said they're going to develop an API for Google Sites, you'll be able to programmatically create a site, and it'll work really well with it being programmatically. You'll get a standard working and a standard view on the site and output from code that you can generate elsewhere.
And Steve, are there any kind of new features that are rolling out soon that viewers might be interested in? Something that's kind of on the roadmap or is recently launched?
Oh yeah, if you're coming from a classic Google Sites world, there's things you need to be aware of, but we'll probably cover that when we look at transitioning. But things that you potentially would expect to find in new sites, whether you're coming to it from classic sites or not, there's no page level permissions. You can't have different sections of the site having different access requirements or different editors or different viewers. And you've got to make separate sites for that. So that's one of the things you need to bear in mind. Separate sites is how Google's trying to utilize Google Sites to use in an environment where you need separate content for separate people that you can't share, or you want different editors to do different pieces. And because they're on separate sites, it means if you go to one site and use the site search, you won't find the content from the other site because the site search is only searching that site. It's not searching other sites around. So yeah, that's something you need to have in mind when you're coming to new sites. That's not going to be there. There's no news or blog tool in new sites. And so, yes, you can do whatever you want with the pages and you can put them in chronological order. You can order them however you want, but there's no automatic tool to do that, to create an archive, for instance, of old content. It doesn't do that automatically. And there's no gadget that you can drop on the page to say, oh, look, here's some snippets from the recent news or the recent things that have happened on the site. That's not there either. So that's something different. New Sites doesn't have any file hosting. You can't put a file on the site. You've got to use Drive for that. And then you can embed that in the site if you want to, or link to it, or embed the folder that it's in the site. And so that's something else that, again, very googly, but not necessarily something people would think of if they've come from other platforms. Um, One of the things that lots of people want to see because they find it useful, especially in intranet kind of environments as well, is there's no tables. There's no table editor in new sites, so you've got to try and address that in a different way. You can embed your own HTML with CSS to do it. That's one way we've done it. You could use some of Google's other tools. For instance, you could use Sheets or Docs, but Google Drawings has a really good table drawing capabilities as well. So you can make a nice looking table in Google Drawings, embed that in your site, and again, that's quite responsive on mobile. And if it gets too small, there's an icon actually on the drawing that you can click and get a full screen version. So again, you can use that to move around. But it's a nice workaround. And I imagine that because we've recently seen the announcement from Google Docs having a pageless view, and if you look at the examples that Google have given of the pageless view of Google Docs, they have not made the tables responsive in there, and you have to scroll around if the screen size gets too small. So that might be something Google introduces later on down the road, because Google Sites, the editor, is, you might find it very familiar if you're used to Google Docs because it's based on the same kind of tool, and so that's why it looks so similar, yeah, and familiar. And so hopefully that would be a path that Google could go down in the future. If you're specifically going to use new sites for a public site, again, there's some things you would potentially expect to see that maybe aren't there. So there's no XML sitemap. So if you want Google Search Console to be able to automatically find your pages from an XML sitemap, new sites doesn't offer that. Classic sites did. There's no canonical URL, again, if you want to get technical. So that means that you can set on the site which URL that Google should be indexing primarily. Again, classic sites have that, but new sites doesn't. And a lot of people who are going to make a website, a public website, would potentially want to see that as well. Public sites, the images don't get indexed. So if you're wanting to have a site that's predominantly image-based, you want people to find your images, that doesn't happen in new sites. Google have deliberately made it so that images don't get indexed.
I know you've kind of covered this already. You know, we spoke about the old Google sites kind of going away and why that's happening. It's an older technology. But I think those timelines are interesting. You sort of mentioned that for Gmail and Workspace users, they're different, the different timelines. Maybe you could talk about that. I think they've recently been pushed back for Workspace users, but for Gmail consumer users, they're still the same.
If people haven't seen the announcement, Google has set back the timeline for workspace users to move on to new sites. So previously it was going to happen at the end of 2021. The automatic migrations and deletions would start then, but now Google has given a bit more time into June is when editing will stop in 2022. So June 2022, you can no longer edit your Google sites if you're a workspace user. If you're a consumer, a personal user, that's already happened, and that's not changing. And then the automatic migrations and deletions for workspace users, they start in July. And so that means at that point, if you haven't already migrated your site, it will take your existing classic site and then migrate it for you automatically, and also make a Google Takeout archive copy in a zip file in your Google Drive. And so it does those two things for you, so you've got them and you haven't necessarily lost your content. So that's something that's happening. Something that happened recently and over time, and Google's not made an announcement about this, so people may not be aware of it, is the conversion tool can now convert a classic Google site that's got 5,000 pages. And prior to that, it was down as low as 1,200 pages. So that prevented a lot of large sites from being moved, because originally new sites had a page limit of 1,000 pages, which has now been increased to 10,000 pages. So that's less of an issue. But even when new sites could do 10,000 pages, the conversion tool could only do 1,000, 1,200 pages. But now Google's increased that capacity, so it can now do 5,000 pages. So that's going to include a lot more people in, a lot more sites in that can now be migrated. And so now we've got the extended deadline, and now we've got the ability to migrate larger sites. That's going to help a lot of people. And then finally, as we've mentioned about page level permissions, if you've got a site with page level permissions on and you migrate that, those page level permissions get lost because new sites just doesn't have anything to be able to do it at all. But there's a new tool which is still rolling out at the minute, which is partial site copy. And what that allows you to do is take a site and you can then copy some of the pages off into a new site. And so that means for those with page level permissions on a very large site, they can migrate the whole site, keep that private, keep it separate, then use the partial site copy tool to make the different sections of the site where you want the different permissions into separate new Google sites, and then you can link them all back together from the original site if you want to. And so it's a bit of a lifeline for those who are using page level permissions on a large site. They can now migrate that whole site, split it up, and then put different permissions on the split up sites.
All right, and what about this migration tool that we've heard so much about? This amazing migration tool. I'd love to really hear a little bit about that, and some of the pros and cons and challenges perhaps that customers have come across when it comes to that.
Sure. And so if you're a personal user of Google Sites, that means you're not using Workspace and you've made it with a personal Google account. That could be a Gmail account or a Google account you've made for your existing email address. That type of Google site is outside of Workspace, and that automatic migration and deletion has already started. So back in September, you could no longer edit a personal Google site. That stopped. And now, as of December, the automatic migrations and deletions have already started, and Google estimate they should be complete by January 2022. So if you are a personal user and you're still using a classic site and you're unaware of this, you need to make sure you're doing something about it now, because it's going to happen and it will just disappear on you when Google's automatic process does that for you. So that's personal consumer users. What people do, of course, just like you've explained in that scenario, they won't necessarily be checking the emails from that email account where Google sent all the warnings to saying this is going to happen. And of course, Google doesn't know you're not checking that. So therefore, you may not have seen that message, and one day you'll come to the site and see it's just disappeared. That's it. And you'll have the takeout archive in Drive, that'll be there, and there'll be the draft created in new sites, but that isn't automatically published. So you need to take those extra steps.
And what about for customers, who have the old Google sites and they maybe, they need to transition and it's a really important site? What's the kind of best practice or workflow that they should be following?
Make sure you have got a backup of your site. So Google offers Google Takeout. You can get a copy of the site that way, and check that is what you actually have. Google can't go and do a takeout of everybody's site and check that it was exactly the same. That's just not feasible or possible. So therefore, do that yourself. Make sure you've got that, and don't just rely on the automatic way of doing it, because the automatic thing will do exactly the same. But so you need to know beforehand: have you got a good copy of your site? If it's a public site, potentially you can use other web scraping tools to be able to get a backup of your site. So that's good. But make sure that your takeout archive is what it is. And if it isn't, somehow make sure you've got that backed up, so you've got that in case you need to move to new sites manually, or you run out of time, or you want to move to a different platform altogether. Once you've made sure you've got a backup, so if the worst comes to the worst, you've got something that you can rely on to recreate elsewhere. Have a go with new sites and the conversion tool. So generally, you want to have, if you're going to go ahead and use new sites, get used to using it. See what it can and can't do. And once you've got used to what it can and can't do, then you're going to have a good idea of, all right, I wouldn't know how to recreate my classic sites page in new sites. Therefore, that's going to set your expectation level of what the conversion tool can do. And so once you're used to using Google Sites, have a go with the conversion tool. You might have to use it and disregard whatever it does for you. If you want to retain your sites.google URL, and so if it's an internal intranet and you need to keep that, or even if you're on a public site and you've never mapped a custom domain to it, you might want to retain that so your search results stay the same and so that people can still find you. The only way you can keep that is to use the migration tool. So the migration tool will let you reuse that original classic site URL, but obviously you may then need to go and change every single page manually yourself. But hopefully you won't have to. There might be a need for you to use the conversion tool to retain that original URL. And so that's one thing you definitely you might have to do. And your only approach might be you have to use the conversion tool and then clean up the site manually. Back in 2016, when new sites were launched, we made a new site and started putting content on there. So we got used to using new sites. And so all the new content and all our new Google Sites how-tos went on a new Google site, keeping to that founding principle that we had that showed people how to use Google Sites on a Google site. We kept that principle. And so from 2016 to 2018, we did that over a slow period of time. And then we realized when the conversion tool came out, it wasn't going to work for us at all. And so we started manually migrating the content from the classic site to the new site we'd already started on. And that we started in 2018. It took us 3 months, and we dedicated 3 months to doing this manually to move 100 pages. And so if you've got a massive site, you can see how it's going to impact, because obviously we had other work to do as well. So yeah, this is an extra job that you potentially don't want to have to do. So you need to obviously make sure.
And then I know we're kind of wrapping up soon. If customers are struggling with moving to the new Google Sites, can you tell us a little bit about how Steegle can kind of help?
There's probably 3 ways in which we can help. Number one is we can help you get used to using Google's new Google Sites. We can train you on that and show you what's achievable. You can have a look at some of the examples that we've done previously. But we can do that one-to-one training or one-to-many training, so you can then use that to create a new site. That's the first thing we could do. Next, we can actually help you use the conversion tool and then advise, is this going to work for you or not? Is the conversion tool going to be a good path for you? Again, you might have to use it to return the URL if you need to. But if it's not going to work for you, we can then help you make a new site. And so if you need someone, if you haven't got the time to dedicate, we've got a team who potentially can help you do that manual migration. If your budget and your time allows, we can do that potentially as well. So those are the 3 things that we can help you do. We can train, we can help you use the conversion tool, and then we can help you do a manual migration if that's not going to work.
And just thinking about the future of Google Sites, I know we could sort of guess where things are going, but if you had a magic wand and you could just say, I can create any feature in Google Sites, what would you hope for?
We'd love to see some of the gaps that are currently there, filled in. Better search. So if you've embedded something from Drive, that comes up in the search results in your site search. That's what I think everybody wants to see, especially in internet environments, which is predominantly where new sites is being used. Being able to find content is key. And so, yeah, that would be wonderful.
So that's it from us, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thanks very much for joining us, Stephen. It was really, really interesting conversation and very, very insightful. I learned a few things about Google Sites and indeed about websites in general, as I always do from conversations with Steve. So really, really pleasure to have Stephen on the show. If you guys have not, please do subscribe to the Dams in Cloud YouTube channel or follow our LinkedIn page if that's where you are. We are also on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook as well. If you're on those platforms, give us a like or follow on there. Also, don't forget to engage. We love questions and comments from people. We particularly get that on LinkedIn and YouTube, but wherever you are, please do engage. And if there's any topics you'd like us to cover, let us know. If you'd like to check out Steegle, you can go to steegle.com. We'll have that come up below. And if you want to learn more about Dams in Cloud, you can obviously go to damsincloud.com as always. That's it from me. I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's episode, and I will see you next week.